What if the most important message in human history was not delivered in a thundering sermon from a mountain peak, but in the silent, impossible flicker of a desert fire? Why did God, the architect of galaxies and the author of life, choose a humble, paradoxical miracle, a common shrub, ablaze but utterly unconsumed, to initiate the salvation of his people? This was not merely a sign. It was a coded message, an enigma of grace and holiness, set against the desolate backdrop of a man's broken life. To understand this message is to unlock the very identity of God himself. The wilderness of Midian was a land of profound emptiness. For 40 years it had been the world of Moses, a canvas of shimmering heat, jagged rock, and an oppressive silence that echoed the void in his own soul. This was a place designed by God to strip a man of everything he once was: his power, his identity, his pride. The sands that stretched to the horizon were a mirror for a future that seemed just as barren. This was not just a geographic location, it was a spiritual crucible, a furnace of humility where a prince was being remade into a vessel. Here, Moses was no longer the adopted son of Pharaoh, a man of authority and education. He was a fugitive, a murderer haunted by his past, and now a simple shepherd. His days were measured not by courtly intrigue, but by the monotonous search for pasture and water. His companions, the dumb sheep he led. He was a man ground down by the mundane, his grand ambitions reduced to the dust of the desert. He believed his story was over, a tragic footnote in the history of his enslaved people. He had no idea it was only just beginning. It was against this backdrop of utter normalcy that the anomaly appeared, a flicker of light on the slopes of Horeb, the mountain of God. At first, it was nothing more than a curiosity, a distant brush fire perhaps. But as Moses drew his flock nearer, the sheer impossibility of the sight arrested him. The bush was engulfed in a vibrant, living flame, yet not a single leaf was blackened, not a single twig turned to ash. The fire burned with a silent, ferocious intensity, yet the fragile branches remained whole and green. It was a violation of natural law, a quiet, breathtaking paradox. We must understand that this fire was a language. Throughout the scriptures, fire is the chosen symbol for the immediate, unfiltered presence of God. It represents his absolute holiness, a purity so intense that it consumes all that is profane. It is the emblem of his righteous judgment and his unapproachable power. To stand before this fire was to stand on the precipice of eternity, before the uncreated being whose very nature is a consuming fire. By all logic, the simple desert bush should have been instantly vaporized, reduced to nothing but smoke and memory. And yet, it was not. Herein lies the secret message of the burning bush the gospel whispered in the wilderness, before it was ever proclaimed from a cross. The unconsumed bush represents fragile, flawed creation. It represents Moses, it represents the nation of Israel, it represents you and me. The miracle was a divine declaration. The holy, all-consuming God can draw near to his creation, can inhabit it without destroying it. It was a living portrait of a divine paradox, the perfect union of holiness and grace, of infinite power and intimate presence. This was no random spectacle designed merely to capture a shepherd's attention. It was a meticulously crafted theological statement, a divine overture for the grand symphony of redemption that was about to unfold. God did not need to resort to celestial theatrics. His power is most profoundly displayed in the impossibilities he makes possible. He was teaching a lesson before he ever spoke a word. The truth revealed in this single, silent image is so profound that, once grasped, it has the power to reshape our entire understanding of who God is and how he relates to humanity. Moses, his shepherd's mind, unable to process the contradiction before him, decided to turn aside and see this great sight. He believed he was acting on his own curiosity, investigating a natural wonder. But he was mistaken. He was not the initiator. He was the respondent. The fire was not just an event to be observed. It was a summons to be answered. This divine curiosity, planted in his heart by God himself, was the first step out of his 40-year exile and into the center of God's unfolding eternal plan. The broken prince, now a humble shepherd, walked toward the impossible flame, unaware that he was approaching the intersection of heaven and earth. He was about to learn that when the eternal God breaks into human history, the very ground beneath our feet is transformed. This was more than a strange phenomenon. It was an invitation to an encounter that would redefine his life and set the course for nations. But before Moses could receive his divine commission, he first had to learn the fundamental posture required to stand in the presence of the Holy One. His first instruction was about to be given. If this glimpse into the mystery of the burning bush has captured your curiosity, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that God often speaks loudest in the quietest, most impossible moments of our lives. As Moses stepped closer, drawn by the impossible physics of the flame, the desert silence was shattered. A voice, not from the sky above but from the very heart of the fire, called his name. "Moses! Moses!" It was a sound that carried the weight of eternity, both terrifying and intimately personal. For the first time in 40 years, the fugitive prince heard a voice that knew him, a voice that saw past the weathered shepherd and addressed the man he was destined to be. This was the moment of divine interruption, where the mundane reality of his exile collided with the absolute reality of God. The very first command issued from the fire was a prohibition, a boundary set between the mortal and the divine. "Do not come any closer," the voice commanded. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." This was not a suggestion or a point of cultural etiquette. It was a spiritual prerequisite, a non-negotiable law of divine encounter. Before any conversation could begin, before any mission could be assigned, a fundamental posture had to be assumed. God was teaching Moses that one does not simply wander into the presence of the Almighty. One must be invited and prepared. We must understand the radical nature of this statement. Mount Horeb was not inherently sacred. It was a desolate, rocky peak in a forgotten wilderness. Its holiness was not a quality of the soil or the stones. It was a direct and immediate consequence of God's presence. The ground became holy because God was there. Holiness, then, is not a location to be visited, but a reality to be entered into wherever God chooses to manifest himself. The Creator's presence sanctifies creation, transforming the common into the consecrated, the profane into the profound. The act of removing one's sandals was deeply symbolic. Sandals were the mark of a free man, the protection from the harshness of the earth, the very instruments of one's personal journey. They carried the dust of every path a person had walked, representing their history, their labor, and their self-determination. To remove them was to become vulnerable, exposed, and still. It was an act of relinquishing one's own journey and standing, quite literally, on ground that was not one's own. It was a gesture of complete and total surrender. In that moment, Moses was being asked to shed more than his footwear. He was being commanded to strip away his identity as a self-sufficient man. He had to remove the dust of Egypt, the grime of his past failures, and the calloused pride of a shepherd who had learned to survive on his own terms. To stand barefoot on holy ground was to stand with nothing, to offer no defense, and to acknowledge that his own footing was worthless in the presence of the self-existent God. It was his first required act of obedient faith. This command defines for all time the necessary posture for approaching God: humility. It is a lesson etched into the very beginning of the great story of redemption. We cannot approach the throne of grace shod in the dirty sandals of our own righteousness or our own achievements. We must come undone, willingly setting aside the things that give us standing in the world to find our true standing in Him alone. This act of removal is the beginning of all true worship, the quiet admission that we are nothing without the one who is everything. The principle established at the burning bush echoes through the entirety of Scripture and into our own lives. Before God can fill us, we must be emptied. Before He can clothe us in His righteousness, we must be stripped of our own filthy rags. This encounter teaches us that God's primary concern is not first our utility, but our humility. He was less interested in Moses the future leader and more interested in Moses the barefoot worshiper. The posture of the heart is always the prelude to the purpose of the hands. So before God revealed his covenant name or his grand plan of deliverance, he established the protocol of his presence. The first word was not about liberation, but about reverence. It was a call to recognize the infinite gap between the creature and the Creator, and to bridge it not with ambition, but with submission. This lesson in humility was the bedrock upon which the entire Exodus would be built, the foundational truth that a holy God must be approached on his terms and his terms alone. Moses obeyed. He slipped the worn leather from his feet and stood vulnerable before the consuming fire that did not consume. He had passed the first test, transforming a piece of ordinary desert into the first sanctuary. The ground beneath his feet was holy because God was there. This raises a profound and deeply personal question for us today. If God's immediate presence could sanctify the desert soil, what does his presence mean for the soil of our own hearts? With his feet bare upon the newly consecrated earth, Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. The human spirit instinctively recoils before the unveiled presence of the Absolute. It is a holy terror, a recognition of the infinite chasm between the created and the Creator. In this posture of profound humility and fear, Moses was finally ready to hear not just a command, but a revelation of identity. The voice from the fire spoke again, bridging a gap of 4 centuries with a single, earth-shattering sentence. It declared, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." This was not an introduction. It was an indictment of human forgetfulness and a declaration of divine memory. For 400 years, the heavens over Egypt had seemed like brass. Generations had been born and had died in bondage, their prayers seemingly vanishing into the oppressive heat. This statement was the thunderclap that broke the silence, a divine assertion that not a single promise had been forgotten or misplaced in the archives of eternity. The primary antagonist in this divine drama is the limitation of the human mind, which equates divine silence with divine absence. We imagine that if God is not actively intervening in ways we can perceive, he must be distant or uncaring. The Israelites in Egypt and Moses in his exile surely wrestled with this devastating thought. But this one sentence obliterates that lie. It proclaims that God's timeline operates on a covenantal scale, not a human one. His perceived silence was not absence, but a period of profound, hidden preparation. By invoking the patriarchs, God was doing more than reciting a genealogy. He was reactivating a covenant. The names Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are legal seals on an unbreakable divine contract, a promise of people, of place, and of purpose. This was a legal declaration before the courts of heaven that the terms of the agreement were now coming due. The deliverance of Israel was not a sudden act of pity, but the meticulous, timely fulfillment of an ancient oath sworn by God himself. His faithfulness was the bedrock of this entire operation. This declaration confronts us with the staggering attribute of God's immutability. In the centuries since Jacob, empires had crumbled, cultures had shifted, and the world had been remade. Yet the God who made the promise was utterly unchanged. He is the great constant in the chaotic variable of human history. For Moses, a man whose own life had been a tempest of change, from prince to fugitive to shepherd, this truth was an anchor. How can our finite minds, accustomed to decay and change, possibly grasp a being who is eternally, unchangingly faithful? This was a direct spiritual confrontation with the pantheon of Egypt. The Egyptian gods were defined by their function and domain. Ra was the sun, Hapi the Nile. They were powerful but limited. The God of the Hebrews, however, identified himself not with a cosmic force, but with a family line. He is a personal, relational, and historical God, whose identity is intertwined with his promises to people. This was a radical redefinition of divinity, shifting the focus from impersonal power to unwavering covenantal love. The battle for Israel's freedom would begin here, on theological grounds. Imagine the impact of these words on Moses' own heart. This was the God of his ancestors, the subject of stories he must have heard whispered in his infancy before he was lost to the Egyptian court. This declaration was a divine reclamation, restoring to him an identity far more profound than that of a prince or a shepherd. He was not an orphan of history, but a son of the covenant, personally called by the very God who had set his people's destiny in motion. It was a call back to his true spiritual home. This truth echoes with profound relevance into our own desolate places. When we feel forgotten, when our prayers seem to hit a silent ceiling, God's declaration from the bush is for us. He is the God who remembers. He is the God of promises made long ago that are still active and alive today. Our hope is not anchored in the flimsy evidence of our present circumstances, but in the unshakable reality of His unchanging, covenant-keeping character. He has not forgotten you, and His timing is always perfect. But to know God's history of faithfulness was not enough. To confront the might of Egypt, to lead a stubborn people, and to stand as God's representative required more than a legacy. Moses understood that he needed to know the very nature, the present reality of this eternal being. The history was the foundation, but what was the source of his power now? A deeper, more terrifying, and more glorious revelation was necessary. The most important question in human history was about to be asked. Moses, emboldened by the reaffirmation of the covenant, yet still acutely aware of his own inadequacy, dared to ask the question that lies at the heart of all human religion. If I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your fathers has sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" then what shall I tell them? This was more than a simple request for a title. It was a desperate plea for a handle, a definition, a way to contain the infinite being in a finite concept that could be carried back to a slave nation. Humanity has always sought to name its gods, to categorize, and thus, in some small way, to understand and influence them. A name implies limits, a function, a known quantity. The gods of Egypt had names tied to their domains. Ra, the sun god; Hapi, the god of the Nile. Moses was asking for a name that could compete in this pantheon, a name that would carry weight and authority. He was operating from a human framework, seeking a divine label. He could never have anticipated the answer that was about to dismantle his entire understanding of reality. The voice from the fire responded, not with a name, but with a declaration of being that transcends all language and logic. Ehyeh Esheryeh. In our tongue, it is rendered I-A-M-W-H-O-I-A-M. This was not a title. It was a thunderous statement of absolute self-existence. It was the universe's ultimate truth, a reality so fundamental it could only define itself by itself. God was not giving Moses a name to be cataloged alongside others. He was revealing the very essence of his nature. He is the ground of all being, the uncaused cause, the one reality upon which all other realities depend. This revelation marks the absolute midpoint of the entire biblical narrative. The central problem, Israel's hopeless bondage in Egypt, is now confronted with the ultimate solution, the very nature of God himself. The deliverance would not depend on Moses' ability, Israel's worthiness, or even Pharaoh's weakness. It would be powered by the simple, earth-shattering fact that the God who promised it, his power is not an attribute he possesses. It is a direct consequence of who he is. The focus shifts irrevocably from the crisis on earth to the eternal character of God. With this statement, God declares his absolute sovereignty and independence. He is not defined by creation. He defines it. He is not sustained by worship. He sustains all things by his very word. He simply rebly is. This truth was a direct assault on the worldview of the ancient world, and it remains a radical, world-altering truth today. We are all beings of contingency, defined by our origins, our relationships, our roles. But God has no origin. He is the eternal present, the constant, unchanging source of all that was, is, and will be. The command that followed was a direct application of this profound truth. Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Imagine the divine audacity of this message. Moses was to walk into the heart of the world's most powerful empire, before a people crushed by generations of slavery, and declare that his authority came from a being whose name was a verb. He was armed not with a legion of angels or a king's decree, but with a statement of pure, unadulterated, and eternal existence. This was the ultimate weapon. This name, I am, is the ultimate promise of presence and sufficiency. He is not the I was, a God of a glorious but distant past. He is not the I will be, a God of a future hope that feels impossibly far away. He is the I am, the eternally present tense, active and engaged in the asterisk now. For a people trapped in an unending present of suffering, this was the most powerful message they could possibly hear. The God who is sending a deliverer is the God who is with them in the brick pits and under the lash. The unveiling of this name was the secret message of the burning bush made audible. The fire that burned without consuming was the visual representation of the self-existent God who could inhabit creation without annihilating it. Now the name I am gave that visual a voice. The God who is complete in himself, needing nothing, is the very one who chooses to draw near, to make his dwelling among the fragile and the broken. The paradox of the bush is the paradox of the name itself, infinite, uncreated being, now intimately and personally present. The secret was now revealed. The power for deliverance was not found in a political strategy or a violent rebellion, but in the very identity of God. This eternal, self-sufficient, ever-present being was now stepping onto the stage of human history to act on behalf of his covenant people. But what did this name truly mean in a practical sense? How could a philosophical concept of being topple the chariots of Egypt and part the waters of the sea? The staggering implications of this name were about to be unleashed with terrifying power. Continuing from this earth-shattering revelation, we must understand the sheer power contained within this name. The name I am was not merely a philosophical concept, it was a weapon. In the spiritual landscape of Egypt, every deity was defined by a function or a natural force. Ra was the sun, Hapi was the Nile, and Horus was the sky. They were gods of something, but the God of Moses was the God who simply point is. This was a declaration of absolute independence and sovereignty, a truth that would dismantle the entire theological foundation of the world's greatest empire. For a people crushed under the weight of ceaseless bondage, this name was a revolutionary promise of presence. God did not introduce himself as, I was, the God of their distant ancestors' glorious past, nor did he call himself, I will be, a God of a far-off, uncertain future. He declared himself, I am, the God of the eternal present tense. This meant he was with them now, in the suffocating heat of the brick pits and under the cruel sting of the taskmaster's whip. His presence was immediate, active, and engaged in their suffering. Furthermore, the name I am is an open-ended statement of infinite sufficiency. It implicitly means, I am whatever you need me to be. For the weak, I am strength. For the lost, I am the way. For the hungry, I am provision. For the enslaved, I am deliverance. The name is not a static label, but a dynamic reality that adapts to every human need without being diminished. He is the all-sufficient source in a world of profound lack, the ultimate answer to every question, and the ultimate solution to every problem humanity could ever face. This divine identity also established the ultimate basis of authority. A being who is self-existent is subject to no one and nothing. His will is not derived from a higher law. His will is the highest law. When Moses stood before Pharaoh, he would not be speaking on behalf of a regional deity or a tribal spirit. He would be the ambassador of reality itself. the spokesman for the uncreated being who holds all of creation in his hands. The coming conflict was not between two nations, but between a mortal who thought he was a god and the God who truly is. How does this ancient truth resonate within the soil of our own hearts today? We too live in a pantheon of lesser gods. We find our identity in our careers, our security in our bank accounts, and our worth in our relationships. But these are all gods, something, defined by their function and utterly finite. What happens when the job is lost, the market crashes, or the relationship ends? We are left empty because we have anchored our being in things that are, by their very nature, temporary and insufficient. The name I Am offers us a different reality. It is an invitation to anchor our fragile, contingent existence in the one being who is eternal, unchanging, and absolutely self-sufficient. To live in the reality of the I Am is to find a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a security that cannot be shaken by the world's volatility, and an identity that cannot be stripped away by failure or loss. It is the divine antidote to the pervasive anxiety of modern life, which is so often rooted in our reliance on finite things. This challenges us to ask a deeply personal question: in which areas of your life are you functioning as if God is the great I was, or the distant I will be? Where do you need to invoke the present tense reality of the great I Am? His sufficiency is not a historical artifact or a future hope. It is a present resource available to you now. It is the power to overcome, the wisdom to navigate, and the grace to endure, all found in His immediate and active presence in your life. The God who is everything in Himself chooses to be everything for us. This name, revealed in the wilderness, is therefore both a declaration of His transcendent power and an intimate invitation to find our all in Him. It is the firm foundation upon which a life of unshakable faith can be built. If this exploration of God's eternal name has deepened your understanding, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others who need to be reminded of the all-sufficient God we serve. But the revelation at Horeb, as profound as it was not the final word. It was a seed of truth planted in human history, a prophetic echo that would reverberate through the centuries, awaiting its ultimate fulfillment. This eternal name, I Am, was destined to take on flesh and walk among us. The fire in the bush was just a preview of a far greater mystery, where the infinite God would inhabit a human form without consuming it. The greatest unveiling was yet to come. For millennia, the revelation at Mount Horeb was not an endpoint but a divine overture, a prophetic whisper of a far greater truth yet to be unveiled. The name I Am was a seed of infinite potential planted in the soil of human history, destined to grow across the ages until it blossomed into its ultimate, tangible form. The staggering mystery of the fire that burned but did not consume was not fully solved in the desert wilderness. It was a divine question posed to humanity, awaiting its final, living answer in the fullness of time. That eternal name echoed through the corridors of Israel's history. It was the name invoked by prophets in times of crisis, the name sung by David in his psalms of praise and lament, and the name revered in the hallowed chambers of the temple. It was the unshakable anchor of their national hope and the very source of their covenant identity. Yet, it remained a name for a God who was transcendent, holy, and separate. The full implication of a God who is both infinitely powerful and intimately present was a paradox not yet made plain. Then, after centuries of prophetic silence, the quiet was broken once more. A carpenter from the obscure town of Nazareth began to walk the dusty roads of Galilee, speaking with an authority that stunned the religious elite and healing with a power that bent the laws of nature. He spoke of a kingdom, of radical forgiveness, and of a relationship with the Father that was shockingly personal. He was clearly more than a prophet. He was a living, breathing enigma, a walking paradox who was both fully human and yet undeniably something more. The ultimate climax of this unfolding revelation arrived not in a desolate wilderness but during a tense, public confrontation in the temple courts. Surrounded by hostile scribes and Pharisees who questioned his authority, Jesus made a statement that shattered their entire understanding of time, space, and identity. They scoffed at his claims, reminding him that he was not even 50 years old, so how could he possibly have known Abraham? His response was not an argument, but a thunderous declaration of eternal being, the most audacious claim ever uttered by human lips. "Truly, truly, I say to you," he declared, his voice cutting through their skepticism, "before Abraham was, I am." John chapter 8, verse 58. In that singular, earth-shattering moment, the timeline of all history collapsed into a single point. The voice from the Galilean dust was the very same voice that had spoken from the desert fire. This was no longer a prophet claiming to speak for I am. This was the great I am himself, the self-existent God, clothed in human flesh and bone, standing right before them. The name was not just his title, it was his identity. Here we find the grand synthesis, the master key that unlocks the initial mystery. The secret message of the burning bush was a profound and living prophecy of the incarnation. The bush, a fragile piece of creation, was engulfed by the fire of the holy God, yet was not destroyed by his presence. In the same way, the humanity of Jesus of Nazareth was fully inhabited by the infinite deity of the Son of God, and his human nature was not annihilated but glorified. He was and is the perfect, unconsumed union of God and man. The paradox of the bush is therefore perfectly resolved in the person of Jesus Christ. How can an all-consuming holy God draw near to sinful humanity without utterly destroying it? The answer is Jesus. In him, the unapproachable fire of God's absolute holiness and the fragile branch of human flesh are made perfectly one. He is the holy ground upon which all of humanity can now stand barefoot and unafraid, the one sacred space where the divine and the mortal meet not in judgment, but in incomprehensible grace. The entire drama of the Exodus, which was set in motion at that burning bush, now points with unerring accuracy to a greater Exodus. Moses was sent to deliver a single nation from physical bondage, empowered by the authority of the name I am. But Jesus, the great I am in person, came to deliver all of humanity from the universal spiritual bondage of sin and death. The revelation in the wilderness was the powerful opening theme. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is the divine symphony in its glorious, completed form. Therefore, to truly understand what happened on that lonely mountain in Midian, we must lift our eyes to another lonely hill just outside Jerusalem. The fire that burned in the bush finds its ultimate meaning and purpose in the sacrificial love that burned upon the cross. The God who declared his eternal self-existent being to Moses is the very same God who demonstrated his eternal self-giving love for us in Christ. The mystery is solved, the message is unsealed, and the invitation to draw near is now extended to all who will listen. The story of Moses does not end with a theological revelation, it begins with a divine commission. He was sent forth from that holy mountain, a changed man. His staff was no longer just a shepherd's tool, but a conduit for divine power. His voice was no longer that of a fugitive, but the mouthpiece of the Almighty. He went not in the strength of his Egyptian education or his wilderness survival skills, but armed with the singular, all-sufficient reality of the name he had just received. His entire mission was founded upon this one truth: the great I am had sent him. This ancient commission echoes with breathtaking power into our present moment. For the great I am, Jesus Christ, gave his followers a commission of their own. After conquering sin and death, he did not leave us as orphans but gave us the same promise that empowered Moses. He declared, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. The same eternal, present-tense God who sent Moses from Horeb is the one who sends you from this very moment. The story of Moses, therefore, becomes our story. We all have our own deserts of Midian. places of failure, of exile, of quiet desperation where we believe our purpose has been lost to the barren sands. We are all shepherds of something, tending to the mundane realities of our lives, haunted by the past and uncertain of the future. We feel inadequate, forgotten, and utterly unqualified, but it is precisely in these desolate places that God chooses to reveal His presence. It is into our brokenness that He ignites His impossible fire. God is still placing burning bushes in our paths. They are the moments of divine interruption, the quiet whispers that defy our logic, the unexplainable circumstances that beckon us to look closer. They are the moments that arrest our attention and invite us to turn aside from our well-worn paths of self-reliance. The question this entire narrative poses to you is this: will you turn aside? Will you investigate the impossible work God is doing in your life? Or will you dismiss it as a strange anomaly and continue on your way into the wilderness? This story is no longer about observation. It is a summons to participation. It is a direct challenge to stop being a spectator of God's power and to become a vessel for it. The same voice that called Moses from the fire is calling your name today from the heart of your circumstances. He is inviting you to draw near, to step out of the familiar and into the holy. This is not a call to the qualified or the perfect. It is a call to the curious, the broken, and the willing. But remember the first command. Before you can receive your mission, you must assume the proper posture. You must take off the sandals of your pride, your self-sufficiency, and your own righteousness. You must remove the dust of your past failures and the calloused protection of your own plans. The first step into your divine purpose is the act of total surrender, standing barefoot and vulnerable before the God who is everything, admitting that you are nothing without Him. This is the beginning of true faith. This act of surrender is only made possible through Jesus Christ. He is the ultimate holy ground, the one place where sinful humanity can meet with a holy God and not be consumed. To stand in Christ is to be clothed in His righteousness, not our own. The invitation of the burning bush is an invitation to come to Jesus, the great I Am in the flesh. He is the one who bridges the infinite gap between us and the Father, allowing us to stand in the fire of God's presence and be transformed rather than destroyed. Therefore, the choice is now yours. You have heard the secret message of the fire. You have learned the eternal, all-sufficient name. You have seen how it all points to the person of Jesus Christ. The voice of the I Am is calling to you now, not as a historical echo, but as a living, present reality. Will you answer? Will you surrender your own journey and step into the one He has planned for you, armed not with your own strength, but with His eternal promise, I am with you? If you are ready to answer that call, to take off your sandals and surrender your life to the great I Am who is Jesus Christ, then we invite you to make this declaration of faith your own right here, right now. Pray this from your heart. Lord Jesus, I believe you are the great I Am, the Son of God. I surrender my life to you. Forgive my sins. Come into my heart and be my Lord and my Savior. I accept you now as the one who leads my life. Amen.